estét kívánok! Szűcs Dóra vagyok. A Matthias Corvinus Kollégium és a Danube Institute nevében szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit a Patriotic Talks első adásán. A 2019-es nagy sikerű Migration Summit konferencia folytatásaként a jelenlegi szabályozásokhoz alkalmazkodva a következő hetekben csütörtökön este 8 órától a Patriotic Talks keretében a hazafiasság lesz a középpontban. Mit jelent 2020-ban a hazafiasság? Kit nevezünk ma hazafinak? A következő hetek beszélgetései során ezekhez hasonló kérdéseket járunk körül kiváló hazai és nemzetközi szakértőkkel, döntéshozókkal. A beszélgetés sorozat kezdetén szeretném felkérni dr. Lánci András rektor urat, az MCC kuratóriumának tagját, hogy tartsa meg nyitóbeszédét.
Dear viewers, listeners, and all virtual participants of this series of conference on patriotism. On behalf of the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, I wish to welcome everyone who is concerned with the topic entitled Patriotic Talks. It means that together with the Danube Institute, we have selected a subject, a topic, that could be called timely. But I would say the subject of this conference is vital or substantial rather than timely. Why is this? It is because most people would believe that being patriotic is a positive thing. But this idea is not necessarily shared by, for instance, the progressives. They believe that love of the country, which actually patriotism means, is wrong. It is something that disconnects us from other human beings. Therefore, everything that is focused on different communities, like the family, or the church community, or the nation, all these communities are impediments to the development or progress of humanity rather than relevant natural communities where we belong to. And this sense of belonging is questioned because we human beings, according to the progressives, we form one community, and we cannot separate different communities within that global state or world state, as from the 19th century on, many progressives believe is the ultimate goal of humanity. This conference is organized by two Hungarian institutions. In Hungary, we have to talk about freedom, patria, and the God together. Why? Every Hungarian school child had to study the history of a war of freedom at the beginning of the 18th century. And that war of independence started with a flag and an inscription on it saying Cum Deo pro patria et libertate. This is the message we would like to send from our part to every viewers of this conference, that God, who is the ultimate source of law, the love of country, patriotism, and freedom belong together. I wish all of you, a active and thought-provoking event throughout the next weeks, which is entitled Patriotic Talks. Thank you for your attention.
Köszönjük szépen! This event is organized in cooperation with the Danube Institute. I now give the floor to Mr. Joan O'Sullivan, President of the Danube Institute, for his welcoming remarks.
For the next few weeks, we at the Danube Institute will be joining forces with the Matthäus Corvinus Collegium to host discussions on the topic of patriotism and why it's an important social virtue. So why is it an important virtue? Patriotism is love of country. Now, we have many different kinds of love. A mother's love for her child is different from that of two lovers for each other, from the love of friends, from that of a scholar for an institution that shelters him, or that of a soldier for his regiment, and from the many other different combinations of eros and agape. Love has many consequences. It can be a source of great happiness or deeply painful, fulfilling or frustrating, a spur to achievement, a motive for sacrifice, a bachelor's momentary distraction, and so on and on. Now, how we experience love is determined to some degree by what it's mixed with. If love is returned, love mixed with love, it can lead to great and lasting happiness. If it's corrupted by familiarity, it may lead to boredom and indifference. That indifference will then disappear, however, if a rival for the loved one's attention appears as well. If love is mixed with jealousy, it can lead to murder. Now, examine love of country in the light of that larger truth. Patriotism can be virtuous or vicious depending on the passion that accompanies it. The view that it leads inevitably to war, advanced by such luminaries as the European Union Commissioner Margot Wallström, ignores this complicated reality and treats all nationalism as if it were the hostile or racist kind. So it's obvious that although love of country can be distorted, love mixed with jealousy or resentment, so to speak, it can also be elevated by generosity. Unspoiled, it can inspire great achievements and great sacrifices, and it provides society with the glue of idealistic fellowship that helps us all get through the hard times. War, of course, but not only war. Many other different kinds of crisis will hit us too. How can we ensure that our patriotism is mixed with other good qualities, such as generosity and solidarity, rather than the bad ones? That's an important question that, along with other questions, we'll be discussing in the next few weeks. Please join us.
Thank you very much. Our first panel, entitled "What Do We Mean by Patriotism?" will be moderated by Rodrigo Ballester, former member of the Cabinet of European Commissioner Tibor Navracsics and frequent contributor to MCC. Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dora. After the two first opening speeches, it is time now to move to the first panel of those patriotic talks held by the Matthäus Corvinus Collegium and the Danube Institute here in Budapest. And the first question that we're going to analyze today is, what is patriotism? What do we mean by patriotism, actually? And to answer this question, I will welcome very distinguished guests. And we're going to start with the keynote intervention of Mr. Denis Prager. Mr. Denis Prager is the author, radio show, TV host, very well known in America and beyond, and is also the founder of the Prager University, a website that displays very short videos on political, social, and economic matters from a different point of view, and one that already hit more than 2 billion views in YouTube, and you already displayed more than 900 videos. A very, very important website. Mr. Prager, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Let me talk to you a bit about patriotism. I am a very big advocate of patriotism. It is essentially a special love of one's country, wherein when one hears the national anthem of one's country or sees the flag waving, one has a special feeling. If you do not have that feeling, it is hard to say that you're a patriot. You may be a wonderful human being, a wonderful parent, a wonderful friend, an honest person. This is not a moral condemnation, but let's be honest. If you are not moved by that, then it is difficult to speak of one's patriotic feeling. Everyone should feel a connection, a special connection to one's country. That not to one's ethnicity. That I do not value. I am not an advocate of blood. I am an advocate of values. One of the great things about country is that it transcends blood. But here is a question, because I speak to many young people through Prager University. We have 1 billion views a year. Most of them are young people, and I get a lot of feedback. That's why we have many people in Hungary who watch our videos. And I have spoken at many universities, and they are taught, you are a citizen of the world. Let me give you an example. The comic figure Superman, a few years ago, Superman, the comic strip, Superman stood in front of the United Nations and said, I am no longer an American citizen. I am a citizen of the world. That's what is now being taught. The left teaches this. You do not have to feel a special bond to your country. You are a citizen of the world. Now, of course, I'm a citizen of the world. That's a given. But if I do not have a special connection to my country, what will I have a special connection to? Europe? Really? Does one have a passion about the European flag or the European Union? Of course not. And it's not expected. What does someone from Portugal have in common with someone from Poland? They're both European, and that's it. They don't even acknowledge in the EU's charter that they both have a Christian background. Christianity is not mentioned in the charter. And I'm a Jew saying this, but we have to tell the truth. So what is one going to have a special connection to? Europe, the world, humanity? It doesn't work. There is something powerful about having a connection to one's country. We human beings need to have something higher than ourselves. Now, that we love beyond ourselves. The most obvious is I love my family and my friends. That is a wonderful thing. But what else? There is a very big loss in people when they do not feel a special connection to their country. If the only passions they have are for their family or the friends that they have, or even professional life, what are people passionate about above themselves? Their family, their friends, and their work. Well, the work ends, everybody retires, so what do you do then? And by the way, not everybody has such close friends. I do. It's an incredibly important part of my life, but not everybody has that. But there is something we can all share, and that is our country. There's another beautiful thing to it. It unites people who are different. The reason there was the horrible massacre in Rwanda of Tutsis by Hutus was that there was no Rwandan national identity. Had there been a Rwandan national identity, a Hutu would have felt a connection to a Tutsi. But they didn't. The whole beauty of nation is that it takes people from different tribes, from different ethnicities, from different religions, and it says you are all, and then fill in the word, all American, all Hungarian, whatever the country might be. Now, can people do patriotism wrongly and immorally? Of course. Everything good can be perverted. Love, sex, religion, everything can be done bad. So the question is not, is there bad patriotism? Of course there can be, especially if it's tied into race. But the fact that something can be done bad doesn't mean you don't do it good. The destruction of national identity is a massive loss in people. What the left has done in all of our countries is it has made the traditional value, God and country, it has made it sound silly. You are an anachronism if you believe in God and country. But what do you have that is higher than you if not God and country? And by the way, God is higher than country. If my country does evil, I have to first have allegiance to God's values. I fully assert that. So what has happened is there is a contempt built in today, at least in some countries, certainly my own, for taking the flag and taking the history and taking the national anthem seriously. This is a terrible loss. people who don't have national roots, what do they have that transcends them? What do they have? If I don't have America to unite me with a Black American, a Latino American, a Native American, a Christian American, a Jewish American, a Muslim American, if we don't have American first, we don't have a country left. And that is what I believe the left is doing in the United States, where patriotism is disappearing. So this is an extremely important conference. This is an extremely important issue. Without national patriotism, what do we have to connect us?
Mr. Prager, many thanks for your very insightful speech. You gave us many ideas on which we are going to bounce back now with our other panelists. And so in order to continue this talk, let me welcome, please, first of all, Mr. Antonio Martino, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense of Italy, Mr. Ronald Reno, who is the editor of First Thing magazine, Dr. Samir, who is the president of the Observer Research Foundation, one of the leading think tanks in India, Mr. Julius Krein, the founding editor of American Affairs, and finally, Mrs. Katalin Novák, the Hungarian minister without portfolio for family affairs. Let's start now with our first question. How would you define patriotism? Is it a matter of values only? Is it also a matter of culture, a matter of origins? Or is it actually a mix of all of them?
In my view, patriotism is a virtue. I would use the word virtue. It's a habit. It's a settled disposition. Yeah, in the classical literature, it falls under the virtue of justice. And the first principle of justice is to render unto others that which they are due. And I think it's self-evident that we owe a debt of gratitude to our progenitors, to our parents, obviously, but also to our fatherland, to use that, patrilineal language, and then, or our mother tongue. It's not an accident that our languages all speak of our filial relation to our own heritage. And so I would say patriotism is honoring and celebrating our heritage. In this respect, it's linked to the commandment in the Bible to honor your mother and father, as well as the commandment to honor God. So those, you could say that the divine gives the gift of creation, the broader context of reality. Our parents give us the gift of life. And our nation or our homeland give us the gift of a settled home or a place that we can be from. And I think we can't underestimate the value of having a home. And not just a home in the sense of an apartment to go back to or a dwelling to return to, but rather a home where we feel as though we belong, where the people, even when we argue with them, as we often do with our fellow countrymen, we have a sense of being recognized. We recognize and are recognized in this mutual interaction. So patriotism is the expression of gratitude for that gift of having a home.
To me, it certainly today epitomizes something broader than nationalism, because nationalism is defined through territory, boundaries, and political regimes, while patriotism could be more profound, could be broader, could be wider, and could be towards something bigger than just the nation state. And in that sense, while it draws its origins from the bloodline and from tribes and clans and cultures and identities, today it in many ways covers a much wider spectrum. Patriotism is a force for good. It is also an important value to nurture and cultivate. And if it is deployed in manners which are useful and beneficial for many, I think it is perhaps something we need to re-engage with quite deeply. I would argue that patriotism is still a far more favorable term than nationalism these days, but both over the last few centuries have been used differentially and have been used by different actors for different purposes. In Europe, for example, nationalism and Germany in the middle of the last century, early parts of the last century, were a complex issue and led to disasters. At the same point, that same word in India was being used to overthrow colonial masters. So it's very difficult to come up with a all-encompassing framework from which to view patriotism or nationalism. I would just argue that if these words are being used to include, if they are being used to give greater agency to people who have been neglected and relegated to the sidelines, if they are being used to demand equity and justice, these are good words. When they are being used in aggressive means and aggressive manners, they can become difficult.
Patriotism is the love of one's country. I think I don't normally use feelings terms, but patriotism has undoubtedly a feeling aspect. If you are not moved by your national anthem and your flag waving, it's hard to say that you have a strong patriotic feeling. It doesn't make you a bad human being.
I think all of those issues factor into it, but perhaps the simplest way to define it is a sense of loyalty to a political community, I would say based on both a shared history and a sense of shared interests. I think it's a lot of people try to ideologize these things and turn them into very abstract concepts, but at bottom, I think practical realities tend to be most important.
Well, patriotism is, in the meantime, it is a feeling, it is a behavior, it is a commitment for your country, for the people. And I think a patriot is somebody who is attached to his or her country. And just as you said, patriotism is in the meantime, it is a matter of culture, it is a matter of origins, and also the matter of values. So mix all of them. And I think that for a patriot, national identity plays an important role, and the love and care for the country, for the people, it is very important. And there are countries where patriotism is culturally has a positive connotation, and there are other countries where patriotism has, historically a rather negative connotation. But it doesn't mean that patriotism by itself should necessarily be positive or negative. According to me, patriotism is necessary, and patriotism is much more a positive than a negative notion. And it is not only a phenomenon without any substance. It has got a substance because it reflects the values of the given country, of the given nation. So it's not just patriotism by itself, but patriotism is always linked to the given country, to the given nation, and its values.
I consider patriotism a very important and good sentiment. It comes from the Latin word patria, which means motherland. And patriotism is love for one's country. In patriotism, there is nothing involving other countries. The patriot loves his own country, but has no antipathy for other countries. Nationalism, on the other hand, is love for one's country, but mixed with hate and xenophobia against other countries. At times, not always. There are nationalists that are not xenophobic. I consider patriotism always a good sentiment, nationalism at times dangerous. Hitler was a nationalist, Stalin was a nationalist. Hugh Trevor Roper maintained that nationalism is stronger at the border. Hitler was not German, he was Austrian. Stalin was not Russian, he was Georgian. So both of them became German nationalists and Russian nationalists, not being born in the respective countries.
Another very relevant question is whether patriotism still matters. How can we promote patriotism in societies that are culturally dominated by individualism and relativism?
I think patriotism inevitably matters. It's impossible to hold together any state, any political community without it. And even liberalism in the United States, for example, actually relies heavily on patriotism even without admitting it. You see that in a lot of the issues around Russia, for example, that have been major media scandals for the last few years. I think the deeper issue today is not so much relativism, because there's actually a very clear sense of moral orthodoxy and moralism in the United States and the West. It's simply not based on traditional values. The bigger issue is that for the last several decades, the best way to make money was to outsource all production, et cetera, to China, offshore as much as possible, and really avoid any obligations of citizenship, whether that be very concrete things like taxes or broader issues around community support and participation.
Yes, individualism and relativism. I'd like to take maybe a step deeper, and I would say the greatest threat to patriotism is the technocratic mentality. So it's utilitarianism that is the greatest threat, because then it's just increase in material well-being is the highest good. And I think that if you look at Brussels, the Brussels mentality is not individualistic, at least not initially. I mean, the argument there is that, well, we have to have these Europe-wide rules and a mechanism, and we're all going to get healthier, richer, and happier together. And what that does, though, is it downplays what I would call the spiritual element of life. That we have spiritual debts, I mean, we have spiritual blessings, and I use the word spiritual here in the broad sense of things that are non-material. And so this technocratic mentality, I think, is the greatest threat to patriotism. Because patriotism, at the end of the day, does not advance utility. It does, I mean, I think a country is stronger if it has patriotic habit of mind, but you're not patriotic in order to make your country stronger. You're not patriotic in order to make your country richer. And you're certainly not patriotic in order to make yourself wealthier. Instead, patriotism, like every virtue, is an intrinsic good. That we honor people, we naturally admire people who are patriotic, people who are loyal to their homeland. And this is ironically even in the case when we face adversaries. You know, we have a disregard for the traitor of a country that we're opposed to in a way that we might admire those who are loyal, even though we regard them as adversaries.
I believe in both the individualism and patriotism. I don't think that they are in any way contradictory. As an American, I can say that the American patriotism and American individualism have always coincided, always. It was one of the elements of patriotism. Our national anthem ends with the words, "The land of the free and the home of the brave." The land of the free, that's individualism. I am free to do what I want, providing it's legal, of course, providing it's moral. So I love individualism. The human being, each individual is created in God's image and is infinitely precious. But how would that, why would a young person think that conflicts with patriotism. If I'm a Hungarian individual, I am an individual and I am Hungarian. I think that they could live with one another perfectly.
To me, values are not abstract notions. They are not endowments from the universe. Values are built at the interface of culture and interests. Interests guide all of us. We have to look after what we need to survive. We have to ensure our security and protection. These are real interests. At the same time, the culture imbibes in this endeavor a certain method in getting there. And I think culture and interest over time become value. And so when people say that, we share similar values, embedded in that remark is the fact that we also share similar interests. And those interests, in many ways, are the underlying glue that marries our cultural experiences with our modern political decisions. So culture and modern decisions are bound by interests, and these are expressed through value terms.
I think relativism, you mentioned relativism, how relativism is related to patriotism today. I think relativism tries to override core values and basic principles. So I think relativism is one of the main fears of nowadays. And we should not let this happen. We should not let relativism override our core basic values and principles. And I think that individual interests and goals are also important. They play an important role unless they are not against the interests of the community. So individual and community goals should go hand in hand with each other and should not harm each other. And I think patriotism is an inclusive concept. So it is not against anybody, but it stabilizes the national identity, and by this it stabilizes also the sovereignty.
Well, the two things are not necessarily connected, because individualism is a philosophy. Individualism is the philosophy that only individuals matter, single persons matter, and their relationship should be based on mutual respect. And then it develops a theory. The whole field of economics is based on individualism as a methodological tool. But an individualism, I am an individualist. I believe in the importance of the single person, his or her rights, his or her liberties. And I think that humanity is based on relationship between individuals, relationships that tie individuals together. Patriotism, on the other hand, is loving the national characteristics, the national character.
Otherwise, do you think that in the last decades, conservatives neglected patriotism for the benefits of economics, management, and individual rights?
I think the deeper problem is actually that conservatism itself in the United States no longer really means anything. And there's a fundamental neglect of any sense of holding a political community together among American conservatives. So on one level, you have the left in America, which wants to have a state without any sense of the nation. And on the other hand, I think conservatives in America have wanted to have some kind of cultural sense of nationhood without any state. And privatizing a lot of the state functions, the national state functions, always attempting to denigrate the importance of the national government. I think these things have had very disastrous effects, both in terms of policy and in terms of larger ideological shifts, where many Americans can no longer articulate why they should even be part of the same country anymore.
It was certainly the case. It has been the case, and it remains the case. After World War II, conservatism in Europe has been dominated, I would submit, by what I would call Anglo-Saxon ideals. And as an American, I support those ideals, but I've come to recognize that there's a paradoxical way in which freedom and individual rights are at the center of patriotic devotion in a place like the United States. And so insofar as I promote a kind of individualism, I am paradoxically promoting American patriotic ideals. Now this intensified, this impulse towards individual rights and freedom, which as you mentioned, manifests itself often in economic liberalism, that this was intensified in the battle against Nazism and in the long struggle against communism. Both were cast, and I think rightfully so, as perverse collectivisms. And so if you see the great threat as being a perverse collectivism, then you are naturally going to emphasize things that break up and deconsolidate the overly oppressive collective. So as a consequence of this, it seems to me that after the end of the Cold War, we did not in the West have a healthy language of solidarity, that fascism and communism discredited strong ideals of solidarity. Recognize that this has become unhelpful over the last 30 years, and I would say it's unhelpful in the United States as well, that we need to recover themes of unity and solidarity that are ennobling and not debasing, as were fascism and communism. And also we need to recognize that freedom actually is one of the greatest threats to freedom in our current time is rootlessness and atomization.
It's a very important question. In the United States, the conservatives that are preoccupied with economics alone are called libertarians. And they believe in small government and obviously lower taxes, therefore, more taxes, bigger government. They are 100% correct. They are 100% incorrect if that is all their conservatism is. It is very big, though. Small government is a sine qua non, an indispensable element of conservatism. You cannot have a big government and conservatism. It's mutually exclusive. But it is not enough. You also need other values. I believe that part of conservatism is Judeo-Christian values. In the United States Declaration of Independence, it says that we are endowed by our Creator, with inalienable rights. That's in the Declaration of Independence of the United States. Our rights come from God. They do not come from man. If they come from God, they are inalienable, cannot be taken away. If they come from man, man can take them away. The secular conservative has made a terrible, terrible, and maybe fatal mistake in thinking that the Judeo-Christian value system is not necessary to conservatism.
As well. So you said that economy was against the patriotic interests or patriotism, but I think these two can go hand in hand with each other. And let me just tell you an example. For example, in Hungary, the family and economic policies which go hand in hand with each other, and we have a very successful economic policy. We have had it in the last 10 years with very good results in the last 10 years, which you can see in our indebtedness, in our inflation rate, also in our GDP growth, and so all over, unemployment rate and so on. But in the meantime, we also represent values while taking economic decisions. So economy shouldn't be against patriotism. And I think an everyday or ordinary everyday patriotism also means, for example, that you try to buy Hungarian food or Hungarian goods if you have the chance, or you try to employ Hungarian employees if you have the chance to do so. So you are trying to promote a little bit the values and the outputs of our economy and your own country. So patriotism can also be reflected in economic decisions, and it should not go against the economic interests of the given country.
And finally, a last question. Given the heterogeneity of societies, how do you think we can create a common sense of belonging and a sense of patriotism in societies that are multi-confessional and multicultural?
It strikes me that one of the great achievements of the Christian West has been to separate the spiritual sword and the temporal sword, if I could use those medieval distinctions. And by doing that, it gave birth to, in the modern era, the nation state. And one of the great achievements of the nation state is to give a focal point for civic unity and civic loyalty that is not, strictly speaking, confessional and not, strictly speaking, ethnic. And so that I think it's unique to the West, although this has been exported throughout the world. But it's part of the genius of the West to have a vision of civic life that is not, it's informed by religion, but it's not religious. It is often anchored in a historic community of people, but it is not identified with that historic community of people. So as a result, it's perfectly possible to have patriotism in a multi-confessional environment.
I think it's a very important question. We'll have to be honest here. If we have to continue to build communities, create stable societies, have sensible nations, have cooperative international institutions and international architecture, we will have to be honest. We will have to admit that there has been a disruption caused by the rapidity and the scale of globalization, and of course, most recently, the hyper-globalization unleashed through technology on issues, on ideas, on certain projects that we are also noticing. If you study the recent developments, especially in the last decade, we are seeing people revert to their most primordial or primitive identities. People today feel more about their religion than they did 10 years ago. People are more aware of their ethnicity than they were 10 years ago. People are reverting to their safety zones. Sometimes I feel that globalization has unleashed a mood of tribalism. People are seeking refuge in their tribes, even as they engage with the world, which is very different and very demanding. So I think the refuge of identity, the refuge within an identity is happening at the same time as we are seeing hyper-connectivity that is being unleashed by forces of globalization and technology.
The identity politics that you referred to does kill patriotism. That is correct. If my identity is purely my race, my gender, or in Marxian terms, my class, race, gender, class is what I call the left-wing trinity, the holy trinity of leftism. If that's it, then you're right. And that is what is happening in the United States. The United States is in danger of ceasing to be the United States. It is the motto of America is e pluribus unum. It's Latin meaning from many, one. America was composed, there's no American ethnicity. America is composed of people from all over the world, every race, everything, every nationality, every religion. So if we don't have from many one, and that would be every country, from many one has to be the motto of every country. But now the motto is from many, many. And so if there is no one, you have no country.
Well, this is difficult. This is not an easy task. But I think that the even the capability of integration of a given country or a nation is based upon its self-identity. And if there is a strong national identity, then there is a better chance to integrate those with a different cultural, ethnical background. So I think that patriotism is actually a good basis for integration. And if you don't have a real self-esteem as a nation, and if you don't have a strong national identity, then you're going to have a much harder time trying to integrate others. And even more is the case when those who are, let's say, arriving to your nation, to your country, and have a very strong national or religious identity, and on the other hand, your country, your nation, your people don't, then it would also cause problems and conflicts. And this won't be very easy to solve. And let me tell you our example in Hungary, because Hungary is a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional country. And there has been tensions between different groups in the past, in our history. So we have learned our lessons. And that is why our government has successfully appeased tensions against the Roma community. We have a zero tolerance policy on anti-Semitism. Ethnic minorities receive substantial state support for their cultural activities. So we don't really have tensions in these matters, and all communities may identify as members of whichever community they wish to belong to, but they are also proud Hungarians. So it seems to be working in Hungary, but it also depends, of course, on your strong national identity and on your willingness to integrate these people, and on the amount and on the time. And that is why we are against this mass immigration happening right now towards Europe. It's because we don't see the capability of integrating of many European countries, and we don't see this capability in Hungary either. So we have to be able to work step by step, and once you don't have the capability to integrate that amount of people already, then it raises the question if you should let this happen. I mean, mass immigration towards your country, and that is why our answer is a very stable no. But of course, we in Hungary do our utmost in order to have tolerance for each other, and to make it possible for people living with different ethnical, cultural, or religious background to live peacefully with each other. And we don't want parallel societies being built in our country, and we think that can be a good path for the whole of our continent, for the whole of Europe, and we can take very difficult and very dangerous decisions also in this matter at a European level, because if we don't strengthen our identities, our national identities, our national sovereignties, and also our Christian culture and our Judeo-Christian roots, then I think that Europe won't be able to stay as strong as it is right now.
Well, to answer your very important question, I need the help of a little country that borders with Italy and it is enormously rich, Switzerland. Switzerland has 4 official languages, a great number of different religions, and ethnical groups are French, Italian, German, Ladino, you name them. Switzerland is a very harmonious country, and it's a very successful country. You see, in 1970, Switzerland was second in the list of wealthiest countries according to per capita GNP of the OECD. And Sweden was third. Now, Switzerland is still second, and Sweden is 18th. Yet, from the point of view of homogeneity, the Swedes have one religion and one language. The Swiss have several languages and several religions. From the point of view of natural resources, Sweden has an abundance of natural resources. Switzerland has very little natural resources. Why is Switzerland still much richer than Sweden? Because what produces wealth is not natural resources. If there are many countries in the world that are rich in natural resources and poor in per capita income. Think of countries like Argentina. Think of countries like Brazil. Think of countries like Russia. Lot of natural resources and yet not much wealth. Why? Because what produces wealth is what Simon used to call the ultimate resource, which is man and his knowledge, human beings and their knowledge. It's human capital that creates wealth.
Dear panelists, many thanks for all your answers and all those elements that you brought into this discussion. It was extremely interesting, and so I wanted really to thank you very, very much for your wonderful interventions.
Rodrigo, thank you very much for this exciting panel. I think we've heard some excellent points. In the next few minutes, I would like to reverse the roles a little bit, and I would like to ask you to share your views on the topic. Firstly, given your background, you are a Spanish citizen, having lived in France, Brussels, now in Budapest. What does patriotism mean to you?
First of all, many thanks for allowing me to moderate this panel. It was indeed extremely instructive and interesting for me. I learned a lot. On your first question, Dora, this is one, given my background, that I've been asking myself quite a lot of times. And sometimes, you know, the opinion changed quite a lot. And I must say that now, at my age, I come back more to the feelings and the opinion I had when I was a child, you know. So what does it mean for me? It means this sense of belonging. It means, as one of the panelists said, a virtue, you know. It's like a bit like having parents, you know. And it's a fact, indeed, and one that cannot be neglected, you know, by only rational thinking. It's somehow a feeling as well, to have this sense of belonging. And it's also something that you discover a bit with the age, with your maturity, with your children, you know. And it's something that is actually inherent to the human being, and that sadly, a lot of philosophers, a lot of politicians in the last 50 to 60 years have been trying to minimize and to belittle as much as they could. And at the end of the day, also, this sense of belonging, which is a very wide and very ambiguous notion where many things can fit, you know, it's not a, you don't need to, it's not a sample of criteria, it's a set of criteria that need to be fulfilled. It's much more flexible than that. It's a mix indeed of values, also of culture. I don't think that values alone are enough. You also need to have this cultural belonging, this cultural identification, and you also need, you know, to have this affection for the place where you were born or where you feel, you know, at home. And that's extremely important. And this is something, again, that has been very, very much belittled and neglected in education, mostly in the last decades. And now we are paying a price for that in Europe.
You've mentioned that this is a sense of belonging, which would imply that this is a very natural thing that we all feel. But I've just read statistics that the 5 most patriotic countries, according to a recent study, are the US, India, Australia, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. It was very surprising to me that there was no European countries among the top 5. What could be the reason in your view?
It's all the more surprising that this list of 5 countries are very heterogeneous. Australia and Saudi Arabia definitely do not belong to the same, you know, like a pattern. And yet they have this in common, that they have this sense of belonging that at the end of the day is the backbone that is going to structure and to give cohesion to a society, to a country, to a nation. How come we don't have that in Europe? Well, as another panelist said as well, the best ideas can be perverted. And this is basically the history of the 20th century in Europe. And so this is one of the reasons. But I also believe that there was a passion in the last 40 to 50 to 60 years, especially in academic circles, to deconstruct, to demythify, to denigrate, you know, to hate yourself. And I have the impression that sometimes we are in a world, at least in Europe, where whatever our continent did in the last 1,000 or 1,500 years doesn't count, is not valued. The things that for which other continents envy us, look at our culture, for example, look at our gastronomy, at our influence that we had in the world, all those things today are belittled, are denigrated, that are no longer taught, you know. And when I said that patriotism is also a feeling, and I compared it to parents, you know, I think it's important also to, you know, when you're a child, you need somehow to, how can I say, to mystify a bit, or at least to love your parents and to think that they are the best, you know. And no worries, time will teach you that they are not, that there are plenty of defaults as well. But if from the beginning, to a 3 years old, to a 4 years old, the only thing you teach them is that their parents are not good parents, that their parents have no qualities, are only defaults, how are you going to love them, you know, once you are a grown-up, a teenager and an adult? It will never happen. And so I think those countries give us, you know, a good example. I think it's a matter of education. And what happened in Europe, again, is that we try to sometimes dilute some of our identities. And this comes from a mental illness, I would say, a pathology that is called the hatred of yourself. Basically, what we are told, what we are, especially, you know, on media, TV, culture, what our children are told, what we were told when we were at school, is to love every culture but our own. And that's definitely a problem.
And what can we do against this deconstruction that you mentioned?
Many things. It's not an easy question, it's not an easy task. But to start, for example, teaching again the affection for your society, for your nation, for your country, call it the way you want, at school from an early age. Today, I mean, this lack, you know, of affection is leading in some countries of Europe to terrible situations. Look at Islamic terrorism, for example, where you have in several European countries, Western European countries, you have thousands and thousands of youngsters who hate their country. They were born in a country that they hate. And in the worst case scenario, it can take us to the terrorist attack that we see on TV in the last 10 years, far too often already. And so education is key, but education again must be changed upside down in several countries, because what is taught right now is exactly the contrary. I think here you have two problems. Sometimes the problem of teaching what is only local to you, only local, and also to, and the other extreme, which is, you know, like to learn about everyone else but your own country and your own culture. And those things are happening in thousands of schools across Europe, and this is something that definitely should be changed. What else should be done? That we also, you know, send this message from other platforms. And I'm here thinking about the media and about culture. You know, when you look at, you know, mainstream TV, when you look when you read the newspapers, the redundant message you get is that think about yourself, look at your belly button, and look to the universe, but don't look in between. And that's, I think, it's also definitely a big problem. So let's start with education. Let's also think about media. Let's also think about culture, you know. And again, even from a psychological point of view, let's assume also that being proud of having a self-esteem, you know, like what applies to a person without a self-esteem cannot go very far. A country without a self-esteem, or a continent without a self-esteem, cannot go very far neither. And I think for Europe, it applies both for countries and for the continent itself. I think there are many things we can be proud as Europeans. And again, we are hearing more and more voices in that direction, but it was not the trend for the last decades, and that's a problem.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Kedves nézőink, nagyon szépen köszönjük, hogy velünk tartottak a Patriotic Talks első adásán. Várjuk Önöket jövő csütörtökön este 8 órától, fókuszban a nemzetállamok. Szép estét, viszontlátásra!